Every major war in modern history has one thing in common. In the weeks before it started, civilians closest to the fault line were going about their lives, buying groceries, sitting in traffic, making plans for next month. Not because they were stupid, because nothing had happened yet. And nothing has happened yet is the most dangerous sentence in any language. Most people think World War III is a think tank problem, something for generals while you go back to your commute. The residents of Kuwait City thought the same in 1990. Restaurants full, malls open, ordinary life, right up until the morning it wasn't. Geography creates structural exposure. It doesn't announce itself. It waits. We found 5 countries sitting inside WW3's kill zone right now. Before the list, I need to give you something more valuable. A list without a framework is just trivia, and trivia won't save you when the map changes. Here's what most people get catastrophically wrong about World War III. They think danger maps cleanly onto visibility. The countries making the most headlines are the dangerous ones. The countries nobody's talking about are safe. It sounds logical. It is completely wrong. And it's the kind of wrong that has put civilians inside active conflict zones in every major escalation of the last 100 years. Picture someone confidently explaining global risk to you at a dinner table. They'll say Ukraine. They'll say the Middle East. They'll say Taiwan. And they're not wrong that those places carry risk. They're just reading the symptom. They're not reading the structure underneath it. They've confused media attention with geometric exposure, and those are 2 entirely different calculations. Here's the actual variable. Danger in a World War scenario doesn't come from being talked about. It comes from being geographically unavoidable. It comes from sitting at the intersection of competing great power interests, whether or not a single journalist has filed a story about your city this year. Think about Poland in 1939. Poland didn't provoke that conflict. Poland didn't go looking for it. Poland sat between 2 expansionist powers, with a flat, indefensible plain that both of them had already mapped. The geography made Poland the answer to a military problem before anyone in Warsaw had any say in the matter. Korea in 1950 was the same calculation. A peninsula at the convergence of Soviet, Chinese, and American strategic interests, with a population that had no vote on whether their country became the opening theater of the Cold War's first hot conflict. The map chose for them. That's what we mean by structural exposure. Not the countries that are already at war. Not the countries generating the loudest diplomatic noise right now. The countries that are built into someone else's operational plan. The ones where geography, resources, and alliance geometry have already made the decision, and the civilian population just hasn't received the memo. 2 types of countries exist in any serious great power conflict scenario. Those inside the friction zone and those outside it. There is no meaningful middle ground. You either sit on the fault line or you don't. And the fault line doesn't care about your government's preferred foreign policy posture. Geography doesn't care about your passport. It cares about your coordinates. So how do you actually calculate which side of that line you're on? We built a framework. And that's where we need to start. We went looking, not for the countries appearing on conflict maps right now, not for the ones with active fighting in their borders, not for the headlines. We went looking for structural exposure, the countries that have no clean exit from a great power war, regardless of what their own governments decide to do. Countries that fail the geometry test before a single shot is fired. We call it the kill zone audit. 3 layers. Every country with significant great power proximity gets evaluated against all 3. Most fail 1, some fail 2. 5 fail all 3 with no asterisks and no diplomatic escape routes. Before I show you which 5, you need to understand how each layer works. Because a country's name on a list means nothing without the reasoning behind it. You need to be able to look at any country, including your own, and run this audit yourself. Layer 1 is what we call the tripwire radius. This is the geographic band within which a border conflict between great powers automatically becomes your conflict too. whether you invited it or not. When a frontier activates between nuclear-armed states, the radius of consequence isn't determined by your preferences or your neutrality declaration. It's determined by missile range, ground troop corridor geometry, and the physical distance between your population centers and the friction line. Every country sits at some distance from the nearest great power fault line. The question is whether that distance is survivable. Layer 2 is the automatic escalation trap. This is where alliance mathematics turns a foreign conflict into your legal obligation. Mutual defense treaties, NATO's Article 5, U.S. bilateral defense commitments across the Pacific, security guarantees written into partnerships and status of forces agreements. These are not theoretical documents. They are activation mechanisms. A country doesn't need to be attacked directly to find itself at war. It needs its treaty partner to be attacked. The moment that happens, the legal architecture takes over, and the government's options narrow to almost nothing. Signing a mutual defense treaty in peacetime looks like an insurance policy. In a World War scenario, it functions like a conscription notice. Layer 3 is what we call strategic irresistibility. Some countries become targets not because of anything they do, but because of what they are: a semiconductor supply chain, an energy transit corridor, a deep water port, a land bridge between two competing spheres of influence. Great powers in an existential conflict will target strategically irresistible locations, regardless of declared neutrality, regardless of diplomatic protests, regardless of any preference the local population might have about staying out of it. If you control something a major power cannot afford to let its rival control, you are already inside the conflict. You just might not know it yet. A country that fails all 3 layers isn't just at risk. It's structurally guaranteed to be inside the scenario. We found 5 of them. 5 countries where the tripwire radius is tight, the escalation trap is set, and the strategic irresistibility is off the charts. Now let's look at which ones made the list. Layer 1. The tripwire radius. Here's what it looks like when it activates. A border conflict ignites between 2 nuclear-armed powers. Within hours, airspace closes. Not just above the conflict zone, above the surrounding region, as militaries establish exclusion corridors and no-fly buffers. Ports lock. Supply ships divert. Fuel prices spike at every pump within 1,000 miles. Within 24 hours, the supply chain disruptions start registering in grocery stores, pharmacies, and fuel stations in countries that aren't even formally involved. Within 72 hours, the economic and logistical reality of the civilian population inside the tripwire radius has changed permanently. Not because those civilians did anything, because of where they live. This isn't speculation. This is the documented pattern of every major 20th century escalation. When the Korean War began in June 1950, the peninsula went from an uneasy armistice to full conventional warfare in a matter of days. Civilians who had been living normal lives, running markets, attending school, working farms, found themselves inside an active conflict zone before most of them had any realistic opportunity to leave. The tripwire didn't give a warning. Here's the specific calculation we run. How far is this country from the nearest active great power fault line? Not a political fault line, a geographic one, a border between states backed by nuclear powers with competing strategic interests and a documented history of proxy confrontation. And then, can the effects of a conflict at that fault line reach this country's civilian population before any meaningful evacuation or repositioning is possible? The average escalation from diplomatic crisis to active military engagement in modern great power conflicts is measured in days, not months. The Cuban Missile Crisis is the famous exception. 13 days of visible tension that most historians agree came within hours of going the other way. Most escalations don't give you 13 days. They give you a news cycle and a window that closes while people are still debating whether it's serious. The tripwire radius isn't glamorous. It's not the flashiest variable in the kill zone audit, But it is the most brutally decisive, because no amount of stored food, no amount of political goodwill, no amount of declared neutrality changes your physical position on the map. Distance from the fault line is the first calculation. Everything else is secondary. The countries on our list score catastrophically on this layer. Not one of them has meaningful geographic distance from an active great power friction zone. Some are directly adjacent. One is already inside it. We'll get there. First, Layer 2. The most dangerous sentence a country can sign is a mutual defense treaty with a great power. In ordinary times, it reads like an insurance policy. In a World War scenario, it reads like a conscription notice with your government's signature already on it. NATO's Article 5 is the most explicit version of this trap. An attack on one member is an attack on all members. Every NATO country has already agreed, legally and structurally, that if the alliance is triggered, they are in the war, not after deliberation, not after a vote. The architecture activates, and the options narrow. The same logic applies to U.S. bilateral defense commitments across the Pacific, South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, and to the security partnerships embedded in status of forces agreements across Eastern Europe. These aren't theoretical. They are operational mechanisms with pre-written escalation pathways. There are two types of countries inside an alliance structure: those with formal membership, where Article 5 or its equivalent creates an automatic escalation trap, and those with deep military partnership, hosting foreign bases, receiving military hardware embedded in joint operational planning, where the legal guarantee doesn't exist, but the strategic reality functions almost identically. Host a foreign power's military infrastructure on your soil, and you become a target regardless of what your treaties say. You've already answered the question of whose side you're on. The number of countries currently locked into automatic escalation pathways through formal alliance membership, bilateral treaties, or base hosting arrangements with great powers is larger than most people assume. Well over 40 countries have formal mutual defense commitments that would activate in a major NATO-Russia or US-China conflict. 40 countries whose governments have already pre-committed their populations to participation in a conflict that hasn't started yet. Layer 3 is where the analysis gets colder. Some countries aren't targets because of alliances. They're targets because of what they physically contain. Taiwan produces over 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors. The Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline carries Caspian oil to European markets through the Caucasus. The Suwalki Gap, a 65-mile land corridor in northeastern Europe, is the only land connection between NATO's Baltic members and the rest of the alliance. Control these locations, and you hold leverage over the global economy, over alliance cohesion, over energy supply chains that entire continents depend on. These aren't prizes. They're strategic necessities. And great powers in an existential conflict treat strategic necessities the same way, regardless of what the local population prefers. A country sitting at the intersection of all three layers, tight tripwire radius, automatic escalation trap, maximum strategic irresistibility, isn't just exposed, it's structurally guaranteed to be inside the scenario. We found 5 of them. Here's what they look like up close. First tier. The countries most analysts already have on their maps, but whose civilian populations are largely still operating as if the map doesn't include them. Number 5. Georgia. Tbilisi is a thriving, relatively modern capital. Wine bars, tech startups, a growing tourism industry. It functions like a city on a normal European trajectory. What it actually is, a country that shares a border with Russia, has 2 regions, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, already under Russian military occupation since 2008, and sits directly on the transit corridor for the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline, carrying Caspian energy to European markets. Russia has already demonstrated, in real time and with live military force, its willingness to operate inside Georgian territory. That wasn't a warning. That was a preview. The tripwire radius is 0. Georgia doesn't sit near a great power fault line. It sits on one. The alliance geometry is the specific danger. Georgia is not a NATO member, which means Article 5 doesn't protect it, but it has deep EU association agreements and US partnership status, making it geopolitically valuable to the West without being legally protected by the West. That gap, between strategic importance and formal protection, is exactly where proxy conflicts live. Add the pipeline infrastructure, and Georgia's strategic irresistibility score completes the picture. The catch: no formal alliance protection means maximum exposure with minimum institutional backup. Georgia faces the full weight of its geographic position without the one mechanism that might deter aggression. Verdict: high exposure, no shield. Number 4. South Korea. Seoul is 37 miles from the DMZ. That is not a typo. The capital city of a nation of 52 million people sits within artillery range of the most heavily militarized border on Earth. North Korean artillery positions can reach Seoul without a missile launch, without an aircraft, without any technology more sophisticated than guns that have existed for 70 years. The automatic escalation trap is explicit. The US-ROK Mutual Defense Treaty means any North Korean military action activates American military commitment, which immediately triggers the question of Chinese counterpositioning, since China has its own security commitments on the peninsula and its own strategic interest in the outcome. The Korean peninsula is the most compressed great power tripwire on the map. Add South Korea's semiconductor manufacturing, Samsung and SK Hynix together produce a decisive share of the world's memory chips, and the strategic irresistibility score reaches maximum. South Korea is simultaneously one of the most technologically vital economies on Earth and one of the most geographically exposed. That combination doesn't create safety. It creates a target profile. The catch: South Korea's largest trading partner is China. Its security guarantor is the United States. In an escalating US-China confrontation, South Korea cannot serve both relationships simultaneously. That structural contradiction is the quiet emergency nobody in Seoul's business district is talking about over lunch. Verdict: very high exposure. Automatic escalation trap fully set. Let's pause here. Some of you are already forming the obvious counter-argument. What about neutral countries? Switzerland has been neutral since 1815. Sweden spent most of the Cold War outside NATO. Singapore has never joined a major military alliance. If neutrality is a viable strategy, doesn't that break the entire framework? Fair question. Let's address it directly. Neutrality works when no great power has a compelling reason to care about your geography. The moment you become strategically irresistible, neutrality becomes a preference rather than a protection. Belgium declared neutrality in 1914. Germany crossed it anyway, because the Schlieffen Plan required it, and military necessity outweighed diplomatic courtesy. The neutrality declaration didn't change the geographic reality. It just meant Belgium entered the war without allies already in position. A neutrality declaration is a statement about your intentions. Great powers in an existential conflict make decisions based on their necessities, not your intentions. Which brings us to number 3, Taiwan. Taipei is one of Asia's most livable cities. Excellent public transit, dense food culture, a tech economy that has made it genuinely prosperous. It also sits 100 miles from the Chinese coast, produces over 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors, and is the single most explicitly named flashpoint in current US-China strategic competition. TSMC alone, one company on one island, manufactures chips that the entire global technology economy depends on. There is no near-term alternative. If Taiwan's production capacity is disrupted, the downstream effects reach every smartphone, every data center, every modern weapons system on Earth. The U.S.-Taiwan Relations Act creates strategic ambiguity, not a formal defense guarantee, but a legal framework that has functioned as one for decades. That ambiguity is itself the danger. Taiwan cannot be certain the United States will intervene. China cannot be certain it won't. The uncertainty on both sides keeps the scenario permanently live. The catch: strategic ambiguity cuts both ways. The same policy designed to deter Chinese action also prevents Taiwan from building the kind of absolute security architecture that would make deterrence unambiguous. It's managed tension, deliberately maintained, indefinitely sustainable, only if nothing goes wrong. Verdict: maximum strategic irresistibility. Tripwire status confirmed. Now we get to the two that keep defense analysts awake. The countries that fail every layer without a single asterisk. No diplomatic exits, no geographic buffer, no ambiguity about where they sit on the map. Number 2. Poland and the Baltic Corridor. Warsaw is a thriving European capital. Cobblestone old town, a booming tech sector, one of the fastest-growing economies in the EU. It is also a NATO frontline state sharing a border with Belarus, whose government has functionally integrated its military with Russia's, and sitting adjacent to Kaliningrad, a Russian military exclave on the Baltic Sea, packed with missile systems capable of reaching most of northern Europe. The Suwalki Gap is the specific geometry that makes this region the most analyzed NATO-Russia flashpoint on Earth. It is a 65-mile land corridor, 65 miles, between Belarus and Kaliningrad. That corridor is the only land connection between Poland and the 3 Baltic NATO members, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. If Russia closes the Suwalki Gap, the Baltics are severed from the rest of the alliance entirely. Every NATO wargame involving Eastern Europe eventually comes back to that 65-mile strip of land. Poland is a full NATO member. Article 5 is automatic. Any Russian military action against Polish territory activates the entire alliance. That makes Poland maximally protected in theory and maximally targeted in practice, because it is the frontline state through which any NATO-Russia conflict necessarily passes. The catch: Poland's population knows its history. 1939 lives in the national memory in a way it simply doesn't in most Western European countries. Awareness and preparation, however, are different things. Verdict: maximum exposure, automatic escalation trap, zero geographic buffer. Number 1. Ukraine. There is no hypothetical framework required here. Ukraine is already inside the scenario. The structural analysis that applies to every other country on this list as a future risk is Ukraine's present reality for millions of civilians who did not choose it. The tripwire radius activated. The proxy magnetism proved decisive. Grain corridors, energy infrastructure, the symbolic stakes of a rules-based international order being tested in real time. And no Article 5. Maximum exposure, no formal guarantee. The catch is the hardest sentence in this entire audit. The catch is that for a significant portion of Ukraine's population, the window to apply any of this framework has already closed. Verdict: kill zone status confirmed. Already operational. 5 countries, 3 audit layers, millions of people living inside a geometric reality they were never given a map to read. So what does any of this mean for a person who isn't a defense analyst? Let me be precise. This list is not a verdict. A kill zone is a structural condition, not a death sentence. What you do with the information is the variable that changes the outcome. First, run the audit on your own location. Honestly, calculate your tripwire radius. Identify every mutual defense commitment your government has signed and what activates it. Ask whether your country contains anything that great powers have already publicly identified as strategically necessary. Most people will discover they have never thought about their home address in these terms. That's the cognitive gap this entire framework is designed to close. Second, if your country fails the audit, that is planning information, not panic fuel. The window to reposition, geographically, logistically, financially, is open longer than most people think. And then, it closes very fast. The populations that fared best in every 20th century conflict escalation shared one characteristic. They made decisions before the window closed, not after. Third, build situational awareness now. Not a bunker. Not a stockpile of freeze-dried meals. An actual understanding of what escalation timelines look like in modern great power conflicts, what the early warning signals are, and what the realistic exit corridors from your region would be if the situation deteriorated. Fourth, build community wherever you are. Every historical case where civilian populations navigated conflict with the least catastrophic outcomes involved existing social infrastructure, networks of trust, shared resources, coordinated decision-making that had been built before the crisis, not scrambled together during it. You cannot build that in an emergency. It already exists or it doesn't. This is not fear content. Fear is passive. Fear sits with the information and waits for something to happen. This is geometry. Geometry is actionable. You can measure it, evaluate it, and make decisions based on it before the map changes underneath you. 5 countries. 3 layers. 1 decision.